There are forces in this world that no monarch can command, no empire can conquer, and no treasury can bribe. They are the ancient, inexorable laws of biology, the quiet, methodical processes of decay that work within every living thing, from the lowest beast to the most exalted king. In the late summer of 1598, within the vast, granite fortress palace of El Escorial, this truth was made manifest in the most grotesque and unforgettable manner. The palace itself was a monument to power, control, and divine right. A severe, imposing grid of stone set against the stark mountains of Castile, designed by a king who micromanaged its every detail. It was a place of prayer, governance, and royal majesty. But in one of its chambers, a smell began to bloom, a stench so profound and so foul that it defied the incense of the chapel and the fresh mountain air. It was the smell of death, but not the clean, swift death of the battlefield. It was the slow, seeping, putrescent odor of a body decomposing while its owner was still alive. This was the final throne room of Philip II of Spain, King of Castile, Aragon, Portugal, Naples, and Sicily, Duke of Milan, Lord of the Netherlands, and sovereign of a sprawling global empire upon which the sun, it was famously said, never set. And here, in this room, the master of the world was being consumed. This is not merely the story of a king's death. It is the story of an unraveling. It is an examination of how a man who personified absolute control, whose entire life was a testament to meticulous planning and iron-willed austerity, met an end characterized by the most absolute loss of control imaginable. His vast armies could not fight this enemy. His network of spies could not root out this traitor. His immense wealth, drawn from the silver mines of Potosi and the spice trade of the Indies, could not purchase a cure. Philip's final battle was fought on a mattress soaked in sweat and pus, against an insurgency of his own flesh. For 52 agonizing days, the world's most powerful man was held prisoner in his own bed, his mind terribly, tragically lucid while his body became a landscape of horror. How does a man who ruled a quarter of the known world reconcile himself to a fate where he cannot command his own skin to heal or the lice to cease their feasting upon his open sores? The story of Philip II's demise is a brutal, visceral lesson in the ultimate vanity of human power and a testament to the one true sovereign to whom all mortals, crowned or common, must eventually bend the knee, decay itself. To understand the sheer magnitude of this final degradation, one must first appreciate the scale of the man and the empire he commanded. Philip was not born to rule a minor kingdom. He was born into an inheritance of staggering proportions, the legacy of the Habsburgs and the Spanish explorers. He inherited Spain, the Netherlands, great swathes of Italy, and the vast, still uncharted territories of the Americas. He would later add Portugal to his domain, uniting the Iberian Peninsula and its own colossal overseas empire under his single crown. This was not an empire in name only. It was a functioning, if cumbersome, global enterprise. Fleets of treasure ships crossed the Atlantic, their hulls heavy with silver that funded Philip's armies and his ambitions. From his desk at El Escorial, a small, somber office from which he could gaze upon the high altar of the basilica, he governed this immense machinery with a diligence that bordered on the pathological. He read every report, annotated every memorandum, and made every significant decision himself. He was known as El Rey Prudent, the prudent king, a title that spoke to his cautious, deliberate, and deeply bureaucratic nature. He trusted few, lived an austere personal life, and cloaked himself in an aura of remote, inaccessible majesty, always dressed in severe, unadorned black. His character was a complex tapestry of profound piety, unshakable self-belief, and a deep-seated suspicion of the world. For Philip, his power was not a political accident. It was a divine charge. He saw himself as the secular sword of the Catholic Church, the chief defender of the faith against the heresies of Protestantism in the north and the threat of the Ottoman Empire in the east. This religious conviction was the bedrock of his identity and the justification for his most ruthless policies, from the brutal suppression of the Dutch revolt to the relentless persecution of heretics by the Spanish Inquisition. His life was structured around the rhythms of the church calendar, filled with hours of prayer and contemplation. This deep faith would be the only shield he had left in his final days, the only framework through which he could possibly interpret his unimaginable suffering. He was a man who built a monastery for his palace, who saw kingship as a form of sacred duty, a burdensome cross he was destined to bear. He was, in essence, a bureaucratic monk who happened to rule the world, a man who sought to impose order on a chaotic globe from the quiet solitude of his stone cell. The world he inhabited was one of stark contrasts, a place where immense wealth and artistic flourishing coexisted with brutal warfare and unforgiving dogma. The Spain of the late 16th century was the heart of a global power, but was also a society governed by rigid hierarchies and suffocating etiquette. At Philip's court, every action was prescribed, every gesture held meaning. The privilege of handing the king his shirt in the morning or his cup at dinner was a matter of intense political significance. This obsession with form and protocol created an environment of immense formality, a world away from the messy realities of life, and it would make the biological chaos of his final illness all the more shocking to those who witnessed it. Furthermore, the medical science of the era was a dangerous mixture of ancient superstition, Galenic theory, and desperate guesswork. Physicians believed the body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness was caused by an imbalance between them. Their primary tools were bleeding, purging, and the application of poultices made from a litany of bizarre and often disgusting ingredients. Sickness was seen not just as a physical ailment, but often as a divine punishment or a test of faith, a perspective that Philip himself fully embraced. This was the context in which the king's body began its final, catastrophic failure, a world of absolute power meeting the absolute limits of its own understanding. Before the fall, there was the image of power, an image Philip had carefully cultivated for over 4 decades. Think of the famous portraits by Titian or Sophonisba Anguissa, the stern gaze, the jutting Habsburg jaw, the figure clad in somber black, devoid of frivolous ornament. He projected an image of unyielding gravity and immense authority. He was the architect of the victory at Lepanto, which checked Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean. He was the man who launched the Great Armada against England, a catastrophic failure that nonetheless demonstrated the terrifying reach of his power. His palace, El Escorial, was the ultimate projection of this image. It was not a place of pleasure like Versailles would be, but a monument to God and the Spanish monarchy, a hulking statement of permanence and piety. It housed a royal palace, a vast monastery, a library, a school, and, most importantly, a royal pantheon, a tomb where Philip intended for his dynasty to rest for eternity. He planned for his death with the same meticulous detail that he planned a military campaign or a new set of colonial regulations. He was the master builder, the master planner, the spider at the center of a global web. This image of unshakable, austere control is the essential backdrop to the horror that followed, for it is the stark contrast that gives the tragedy its soul-shattering power. The turning point, the beginning of the end, was not a single, dramatic event, but a slow, agonizing journey. In the early summer of 1598, the king, now 71 years old, decided to travel from Madrid to his beloved El Escorial, the palace that was his life's work and his chosen final resting place. He was already a man in constant pain. For years, he had been tormented by gout, a vicious form of arthritis that inflamed his joints, turning his hands and feet into exquisitely sensitive knots of agony. The slightest touch of a bedsheet could send shockwaves of pain through his body. He also suffered from recurring bouts of what was then called quartan fever, likely a form of malaria, which left him weakened and trembling. Yet, he was determined to make the journey. The trip, only some 30 miles, became an ordeal of epic proportions. Unable to bear the jostling of a carriage, Philip had to be carried in a litter, a special chair borne by men. Every step, every jolt on the rough Spanish roads, was a source of fresh torment for his inflamed joints. The journey took 6 excruciating days. Upon his arrival at El Escorial in late June, it was clear that this was no ordinary bout of illness. The arduous journey had broken something within him. He was carried to his bedchamber, a relatively small, simple room with a window that opened directly into the basilica, allowing him to see and hear the Mass from his bed. It was from this bed that he would never rise again. His physicians, the most esteemed in the kingdom, gathered around him, their faces grim. They saw the familiar signs of his chronic ailments, but there was something more. The king's body, worn down by decades of relentless work, stress, and chronic pain, seemed to have lost its ability to fight back. A fever took hold and would not break. His gout, once a torment, now became a living nightmare, the pain so intense that he could not bear any weight upon his limbs. He lay on his back, immobile, a prisoner of his own failing physiology. The initial hope that this was just another severe attack soon curdled into a quiet, terrifying realization that spread through the court like a contagion. The king was dying. The final 52-day vigil had begun. The first stage of his final decline was dominated by the fever and the relentless pain of his gout. But soon, new horrors emerged. As he lay motionless day after day, his skin began to break down. Bed sores, the inevitable consequence of immobility, began to fester on his back and hips. In the humid summer heat, these sores did not heal. They became infected, transforming into suppurating ulcers. Then came the carbuncles. For large, angry abscesses erupted on his chest and, most agonizingly, on his right knee, which was already swollen and misshapen by gout. These were not mere pimples. They were deep, volcanic infections that burrowed into his flesh, radiating heat and a pain that transcended even the torture of his joints. The royal chamber, once a place of quiet prayer and global governance, began to transform. The air grew thick with the cloying, sweetish smell of infection, a scent that the frantic burning of herbs and incense could no longer conceal. The physicians, bound by the medical dogmas of their time, were helpless. In fact, their interventions likely made everything worse. They subjected the frail, elderly king to a litany of useless and torturous treatments. They prescribed purges and enemas to cleanse his system of the supposed excess humors, further dehydrating his feverish body and robbing him of what little strength he had left. They performed bleedings, opening his veins to let out the bad blood, a practice that only weakened him further and put him at greater risk of infection. For the festering sores, they applied poultices made of ingredients like pigeon dung and powdered minerals, which served only to introduce new bacteria into the open wounds. They lanced the abscesses, releasing rivers of pus that soaked the royal linens. But without any understanding of sterile procedure, the wounds would simply become reinfected, often more severely than before. Philip endured it all with a stoicism that stunned his attendants. He submitted to every painful procedure, believing it was God's will. He was fighting for his life with the only weapons his age knew, and they were weapons that were turned against him. As the days bled into weeks, the situation in the king's chamber devolved from a medical crisis into a scene of pure body horror. The 4 great abscesses refused to heal. They were open, weeping craters in his body, constantly oozing a foul-smelling mixture of blood and pus. The royal attendants, including his devoted daughter, the Infanta Isabella Clara Eugenia, and his son and heir, the future Philip III, faced the grim, daily task of changing his dressings and cleaning his wasted body. It was a duty that tested the strongest stomachs. The stench became overwhelming, a physical presence in the room that clung to clothes and hair, a miasma of decay that seemed to seep into the very stones of the palace. Courtiers who were granted the rare and dreadful honor of an audience would enter the antechamber, brace themselves, and step into a wall of putrefaction. They would see their mighty king, the architect of their world, reduced to a skeletal figure lying amidst soiled linens, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes still sharp, still aware. The contrast was ghastly, the alert, intelligent mind trapped inside a rotting shell. The psychological toll of this ordeal is almost impossible to comprehend. Philip was not in a coma. He was awake and lucid for almost the entire 52-day period. He was a fully conscious witness to his own decomposition. He could feel the fire of the infections, smell the stench of his own decaying flesh, and see the horror and pity in the eyes of his children and servants. For a man whose entire life was predicated on control, dignity, and a carefully constructed image of remote majesty, this was the ultimate humiliation. Yet, by all accounts, he did not rage. He did not curse his fate. Instead, he turned to the one pillar that had supported his entire existence, his faith. He interpreted his suffering not as a meaningless biological event, but as a divine trial, a purgatory on earth. He believed God was testing him, purifying his soul through the crucible of physical agony, allowing him to pay for his sins before facing his final judgment. He spent his waking hours in prayer, listening to the priests who read to him from the lives of the saints, many of whom had also endured terrible physical martyrdoms. He was preparing himself for what he called the Great Journey. This period was not one of passive suffering, but of active, meticulous preparation for death. Just as he had planned the construction of El Escorial, he now began to orchestrate his own passing. He dictated final instructions for the governance of the empire, ensuring a smooth transition of power to his son. He reviewed his will, making sure his bequests were in order. He gave spiritual advice to his children, urging them to remain steadfast in their Catholic faith. And with a chilling practicality, he made arrangements for his own funeral and burial. He asked to see the coffin he had ordered for himself years before. It was brought into the room, a simple casket of wood, and placed where he could see it. It served as a constant reminder of his mortality, a focal point for his spiritual meditations. He also requested that various holy relics be brought to his bedside, including, it was said, the withered hand of a saint and bones of martyrs. He clung to these objects, believing in their power to ease his spiritual passage, even as they offered no relief to his tormented body. He was a king, even in his decay, commanding the final, grim ceremonies of his own reign. The court itself was thrown into a state of suspended animation. The great machine of the Spanish government, which had always revolved around the king's personal attention, began to slow. Decisions were delayed, and a sense of uncertainty permeated the corridors of El Escorial. The courtiers, accustomed to the rigid and predictable rhythms of Philip's rule, now existed in a state of anxious waiting. They whispered in shadowed hallways, their fine silks and velvets unable to mask the pervasive sense of dread and the faint, lingering odor of the sick room. The atmosphere was a bizarre mix of political maneuvering, as factions began to subtly align themselves with the heir apparent and genuine, horrified grief. The Infanta Isabella, in particular, was a figure of tragic devotion. She rarely left her father's side, personally tending to his most gruesome needs, changing his pus-soaked bandages and offering him what little comfort she could. Her love and fortitude in the face of such horror stood in stark contrast to the political calculations beginning to stir elsewhere in the palace. The king's slow death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a political event, and the future of the empire hung in the balance, suspended in the stinking air of his chamber. As August wore on, the king's condition reached new depths of degradation. His body was now little more than a skeleton draped in skin, his muscles atrophied from weeks of immobility. The infections continued their relentless march, and a new, final humiliation was visited upon him. Because of the constant discharge from his sores and the inability to properly clean him without causing excruciating pain, his body became a breeding ground for parasites. Lice infested his hair and his ulcerated flesh. Some accounts, likely embellished but reflecting the sheer horror of the scene, even claimed that maggots began to breed in his open wounds while he was still alive. He was being literally consumed. This was the absolute nadir, the point at which the king of Spain and the Indies, the defender of the faith, became indistinguishable from the most wretched beggar dying in a forgotten alleyway. He had been reduced to his most basic biological components, and those components were failing in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The symbol of absolute human power had become a feast for the lowest of creatures. The final days were a blur of prayer and pain. Philip, now barely able to speak, knew the end was near. He made his final confession and received the last rites of the church. He said his farewells to his children, Philip and Isabella. He reportedly held a crucifix in one hand and a blessed candle in the other, his eyes fixed upon them as he prepared to meet his Maker. He had asked that his decaying body be displayed to the court after his death, a final, terrible lesson in humility and the vanity of worldly glory. He wanted his courtiers to see what becomes of kings, to look upon his ruined flesh and contemplate their own mortality. His mind, the seat of his power and his faith, remained a fortress of calm resignation even as the walls of his body crumbled into dust around it. He was no longer fighting the decay. He was embracing it as the final, necessary step in his journey toward salvation. The climax of this long agony arrived in the pre-dawn hours of September 13th, 1598. After 52 days of torment, the king's breathing became shallow, his pulse faint. The gathered priests and family members watched as the last flicker of life receded. With the crucifix clutched to his chest, Philip II of Spain drew his last, rattling breath. In the silent room, the only sound was the weeping of his children and the soft prayers of the monks. A profound, if somber, sense of relief settled over the chamber. The suffering was over. The great king was dead. The immediate task that followed was one of singular horror, the preparation of the body for its lying-in state and burial. The attendants who had to wash and dress the corpse were confronted with a sight that would haunt their nightmares. The body was emaciated, covered in gaping, foul-smelling sores, and ravaged by its long ordeal. It was a testament to the sheer force of will that had kept a soul tethered to such a ruined vessel for so long. The handling of the king's remains was a grim and solemn affair. Despite the horrific state of the body, the strictures of royal protocol had to be observed. The corpse was embalmed, a difficult task given the extent of the decay, and then dressed in simple monastic robes, a sign of humility before God. As Philip had commanded, his body was laid out for the court to see. It was a shocking, powerful sight. The men and women who had bowed before him in his glory now looked upon his wasted, broken form, a stark and unforgettable memento mori. The stench of death, though now masked with perfumes and spices, still hung heavy in the air, a final reminder of his long suffering. The funeral rites were carried out with all the pomp and circumstance befitting a Spanish monarch, but the true ceremony had been the 52-day vigil in the sick room. The grand processions and solemn masses were merely an epilogue to the raw, visceral drama of his physical dissolution. His body was then carried to its final resting place, the magnificent royal pantheon he had constructed directly beneath the high altar of the basilica. This octagonal chamber of polished marble and gilded bronze was designed to be the eternal home of the Spanish Habsburgs, a symbol of their enduring power and piety. As they placed his simple coffin into its designated niche, the irony was palpable. The man who had built this glorious, incorruptible vault of stone and metal had arrived there in a state of utter corruption. He had designed a tomb to defy time, but his own body had surrendered to it in the most dramatic way possible. The official narrative, of course, would focus on his piety, his stoic endurance, and his good death. Chroniclers would write of his Christian fortitude and his saintly acceptance of suffering. This was the necessary propaganda of power, the story that transformed a grotesque biological event into a tale of spiritual triumph. The raw, hideous details of the lice, the pus, and the stench would be softened, glossed over, or omitted entirely in favor of a narrative that reinforced the sanctity of the monarchy. But for those who were there, the true story was seared into their memory. The succession was seamless, just as Philip had planned. His son became King Philip III, and the machinery of the Spanish Empire continued to grind on. But an era had ended. The death of Philip II marked a psychological turning point for Spain. He had been a towering, dominant figure for nearly half a century. His successors would lack his fanatical work ethic and his grasp of detail, and the long, slow decline of Spanish hegemony would begin under their watch. The immense power he had wielded was a personal force, driven by his own unique character, and it could not be so easily bequeathed as his titles and territories. His legacy remains a subject of fierce debate. Was he the prudent king, the dutiful defender of the faith, or was he the demon of the South of Protestant propaganda, a cruel, intolerant tyrant responsible for untold suffering? He was, in truth, all of these things, a complex, driven man whose immense power had both built and destroyed, protected and persecuted. But his most enduring lesson may not be political or military. It is biological. It is a story about the fundamental vulnerability of the human body. Philip's end serves as the ultimate refutation of the myth of power. It demonstrates that no amount of wealth, authority, or divine right can alter the basic, humbling contract of mortality. His vast empire could move mountains of silver across oceans, but could not mend a single festering sore on his knee. His absolute authority could condemn a heretic to the flames, but it could not command a single louse to leave his body. He was a man who sought to impose an ironclad order on a chaotic world, only to have the most profound and uncontrollable chaos erupt from within his own skin. The story strips away the crown, the titles, and the black robes, and reveals what lies beneath: a fragile, fallible, and ultimately decomposing organism, no different from any other. Think, for a moment, of the contrast. See the portraits of the king in his prime, his hand resting on a globe, his gaze promising dominion over the known world. See the rigid, imposing lines of El Escorial, a palace designed to project power for 1,000 years. Now, juxtapose that with the reality of his end: a frail old man, trapped in a bed, his body a battlefield for microbes. Imagine the whispers of his courtiers, the quiet weeping of his daughter, the cloying, inescapable smell of his own decay. The public image was one of invincible, almost divine, authority. The private reality was one of abject, biological collapse. This chasm between the symbol and the man is where the true, terrifying lesson of Philip's death resides. It reminds us that history is not just about treaties and battles. It is about bodies that hunger, that age, that feel pain, and that fail. In the end, the story of Philip II's death is a profound and grotesque memento mori delivered on an imperial scale. It is a cautionary tale written in pus and prayer. The man who ruled a global empire discovered on his deathbed that the only territory he truly owned was his own consciousness, and that even this was a kingdom besieged by the rebellion of his own cells. His palace of El Escorial, which he built as a monument to his power and a gateway to heaven, became the theater for a terrifying demonstration of human frailty. It stands today as silent, stony witness to the fact that all power is temporary, all glory is fleeting, and that the final, universal king is death, who rules from a throne of bone and whose ultimate decree is the simple, inexorable return to dust. Philip II's final, unspoken sermon was his own decomposition, a lesson more powerful than any edict he ever signed, a truth more absolute than any dogma he ever enforced.